Welcome to Living Outside the Matrix, the show for thinking people, where we explode some of the many modern myths of today by questioning important issues and often overturning the conclusions of the mainstream narrative. Hi there, my name's Nigel Howard, I'm your host, and on the show today we are going to look at the topic of gender, a very, very broad topic, obviously affecting all of us, and one around which there is much distraction and confusion and some even irrelevant issues raised in the mainstream today. So we're going to dissect that topic. And with me today to do that is Darren Christopher Deojee. And for those of you who may already know him, he used to be known as Darren, but I'm going to be calling him Christopher today. Christopher is an accomplished.
You can call me Darren if you want.
Christopher is an accomplished international teacher. He's a speaker and an activist. He's also an entrepreneur, father, and a home educator, as well as much more. But he's known as a modern medicine man from the north, and most importantly for today's discussion, he's an experienced gender worker, and he's been studying gender for quite a few years. So, Darren Christopher Deojee, thank you so much for joining us, taking the time to be on the show today, and a very warm welcome.
A great pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on. This is such a hot topic, and it's you know, there's so many different opinions about it. It's a real privilege to come on. I have to be careful using the word privilege around the subject of gender, but it's a real privilege to be on the show, to be able to discuss it with you. Yeah, great to be here. Thank you.
Fantastic. So in order to kick off, I wanted to try and set the sort of broad context, because obviously gender is a massive topic, but it's also one that really needs nailing down and defining, because gender, you know, it can mean a lot of different things to different people. So if we can try to, we will get around to accurately defining our terms, but obviously, you know, we're all aware that there are some fundamental differences between men and women, between the two sexes. We've got the historical perspective, the fact that these gender roles, they change and morph across time and also across cultures. So there's a wide variety of change going on. If we look back a few hundred years, I believe it's true that to a certain extent men owned women, and then you've got the vote and the suffragettes. Actually, it's 100 years, you know, since the suffragettes won the vote in England. I believe it was February the 6th of 1918. But so you've got this historical context of women getting the vote, the whole change of our industrial society with the shape of work changing and the nature of jobs changing and what jobs can be performed by women as well as men. So we've got a very varying and moving terrain, if you like. Yeah. And when we fast forward completely to today, we've even got the bizarre notion of children being instructed that gender, biology and sex are unrelated, and I think there's a great danger here that young people could be misinformed. So and we've also got issues such as gender violence. So there's an awful lot going on. Yeah. And the overarching context, which I think is important to bear in mind, is that we do live in an age of the information age, but the disinformation age. Yes. So there's propaganda, there's truth, there's spin, there's all of this mix out there, and hopefully, you know, we can today shed a little bit of light over what we all need to know, and also what may be considered perhaps froth and distraction and techniques to divide us all. So, having said that, Chris, did you want to add anything to that, Chris?
Well, just that you know, there's a lot of bases in there. You know, there was a lot of things mentioned there. Yeah. But go on. Yeah.
So maybe we could start by defining gender, and okay. if I could just kick that off with saying that we've got two sexes. The human race has two sexes and only two sexes that are responsible for the biological continued procreation of the human species. So if you like, the male and the female sexes are the as concepts are the genetic roots of everything that we talk about with respect to gender, because it all really points back to these two different kinds of human being, I would suggest. But maybe I could bat the ball to you there, Chris, and invite you to offer some definitions.
That's a big one. It's a big one. Defining it may take us a little bit longer because there's so much revisionist information out there. So revisionist meaning people who are changing the narrative of the past. and that is to suit their own confirmation biases. That's the other thing that you didn't address earlier, and there's a big issue that we are dealing with today, is that a lot of the disinfo and info that's out there is confirmation bias, which is people who are, painting a picture from their experience and perspective. Now, in the modern parlance, this is called intersectionality. And it really is, this is getting. We already get complicated here, because what intersectionality is saying is basically you cannot know another person's experience unless you have it. And even if you are a man, it doesn't mean that your experience can be compared to any other man. And intersectionality is perhaps one of the greatest philosophical divide and conquers I've ever come across, because it doesn't really allow us to form alliances based on shared experience, because it highlights the differences and separates us based on small differences, often objective, like our colour, our sex, our location, our income, our parental income bracket, and any of these things being different is being used these days to say, well, you cannot speak for or understand this person in this other position. All is being demanded from all of us collectively in those situations is to stay quiet and receive the truth of this other person, because it is so whole and pure and true. And this kind of approach has dominated the gender dialogue of the last generation, where so I'm gonna now join up to where you were, which is sexes. So the problem we have today is that modern children are being told that there is no relationship between gender and sex. There's absolutely no correlation, that they cannot trust what they see when they look down at their body. They cannot trust that information that has nothing to do with gender in the modern parlance. And what happens to children as they hit puberty these days is they are presented with a list, depending on which country you're in the West. It could be from anything with 12 to 50 options on there, saying, well, which one of these are you? What is your gender? Whereas what we're looking at, what we're really dealing with there, are preferences. These are behavioural preferences. And it's literally about, where do you like to rub yourself? Literally. What attracts you to rub yourself and get off on? The thing is, though, that is being named as a gender rather than a behavioural or sexual preference, what in the past we would have called a fetish or something along those lines. And these days, certain fetishes, like people who like to go and rub themselves against trees, that is being attributed as being a gender. That's an ecosexual. Somebody likes to go and make love to the earth, but that is being prescribed an actual gender. So kids are saying, well, am I one of them? I don't know. And I think you nailed the biggest issue, and this is where I get into a lot of trouble when I'm speaking, because to me, the thing that determines whether something is a gender or not is whether it is stable and whether it is fertile. And it's the fertility that is the big issue here. And that was what you said in a more philosophical parlance, but there is only one fertile permutation of the sexes, which is a man and a woman. Whether they have alternate preferences doesn't matter. They can be trans men and women, it doesn't matter, but their fertility, their birth sex. They can be gay people, but their fertility is based on their birth sex and the complementary sex, man and woman. Because of things like the free market and state intervention, there is the illusion of fertility being created with these other gender permutations that are confusing the issues. People are being told that they can live a heteronormative kind of family life because they can use the free market to buy or adopt or procure children in some way or another. And this really is muddying the water. But for me, gender as distinct from sex would be about the orientation. So, and there is a genuine aspect there. And I also want to say there is a third sex, and it's to be fair on those that are, but there's a very small percentage. We're looking at between 0.7 and 1.7% of the people are intersex / hermaphrodite, where they aren't clearly both. There are a bit of both in there, but there's such a small percentage. The problem we have these days is that small percentage is being used to paint the picture of a spectrum of gender, a spectrum of sex, that man and woman isn't even that clear cut. And
Sure.
It really is confusing the matters. And when I speak to people about this, they're saying, yes, but you get men who don't have balls or women who don't have uteruses, but they're still women. And that's being used to confuse the matter rather than in the traditional scientific biological referencing, which would be, well, these are mutations. These are variances. Now, obviously, it's not nice to say the word mutation because people think, oh, you're calling me a mutant. But no, it's not that. It's just, this is a scientific term that used to be used, but the problem is this is all now being used to paint a picture of a gender spectrum where man and woman isn't a fixed thing, and you can be any millions of things within it. And then on that foundation of grey sex, you then have grey gender, which is whatever you feel can be named into a gender. So that now in Canada we have something like 70 genders. But
Okay.
from our point of view, I would say that there is heterosexual, which is a man or a woman which is attracted to the complementary sex. You have homosexual, which is a man or a woman that is attracted to the same sex. And then you have bisexual, which is a man or a woman which is attracted to both sexes. But that is the measure to me. It's genuine attraction. It's the attraction that denotes the orientation, and the orientation can be used to describe the gender. So that would be my position on gender, would be that we have three. You have heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, and otherwise we have preferences.
Okay, so we've got three genders, and gender as such is, you're saying, is an orientation. So it's not...
I would say it's an orientation, yeah.
Okay.
And it's not fixed. That's the other thing. It can slide. You can have people who are... And this is again being used to grey the area up, really, because you can have people who are in heterosexual marriages and they have children and a family, and then they come out as gay later on in their life. But we don't necessarily have to get into that today, but it does show that there can be a swing that can take place there that is genuine.
Okay, so let's also identify terms like masculine and feminine, perhaps as being attributes of gender. So these are the characteristics. Would you agree? Are of the characteristics of a particular sex. The masculine being the characteristic of the male, and vice versa. Are there any other? I think other terms we can probably define as we go along, Chris.
Yeah. So this is where we start to get into the tricky area straight away. I mean, it was tricky already, but it gets trickier straight away here, because this is where the idea of gender roles comes from. Because most people who are looking at the subject of gender cannot separate what we're talking about here, masculine and feminine, from roles.
Great. Okay. Yeah.
Can't separate it. And this is why now, when people are talking about gender non-binary or tearing down patriarchy or whatever, but as an attack on roles, but all they're doing is they're attacking roles and
attacking behaviours as well. Would you say?
Behaviours. Basically saying, if my daughter wants to be a rock climber and a construction worker, then why shouldn't she be? And of course, there is no problem there. I mean, most reasoning individuals won't have a problem with somebody of capacity and interest pursuing their aspirations.
Indeed.
But there's
it seems like
there's a logical fallacy that the role is the gender, is the masculine, or the role is the feminine.
Sure. I'm sorry to interject there, but it seems to me that there's an all-pervading sense of subjectivism creeping over things, where there's objective reality and there's everyone's experience and feelings and preferences which occur within that context. But it seems to me, from what you were saying earlier, that the subjective experience is that there's some sort of attempt to change things out there in reality from the subjective experience, to make definitions and rules and to prescribe on the basis of 100 different preferences, 100 different subjective experiences, and nothing to not wishing to take anything away from the subjective experience, of course, but it seems to be inappropriately distorting the issue, shall we say?
Yeah, I agree completely. That is exactly the issue. That is exactly it, and that is where there is an attempt to objectify the subjective, but a subjective which doesn't match the objective real. So if we were looking at things scientifically, it would be a case of, well, I have a subjective premise, it's a hypothesis, so I test the hypothesis. If it passes the experiment, then we can agree it's an objective fact. If it fails, then it's not. What we're having now is the fact that there are subjective tests which don't pass the objective experiment, but where we're being told no, the objective is it cannot be trusted, the subjective reigns supreme. And this really is the rise of the subjective in a way, and I can't see it going anywhere but chaos, because of exactly the reason that you're saying you've got 100. 100 is just the beginning. So we're already at, I think in Canada, we're looking at 70 odd genders, where there's now legislation that says that if you do not comply with somebody's subjective demands as to their identity, then it can be a hate crime or hate speech, and you can go to jail for it, which is really bordering on madness to me, because there's nothing wrong with, as Jordan Peterson would say, inviting me and asking me if I would so kindly address you as a female, even though you appear objectively to me as a male. There's nothing wrong with somebody politely requesting that, and it's then up to me with my free will as to whether I wish to honour that or not. The thing here is the state is intervening, where it's like, well, as Jordan would say, it's compelled speech. We're being compelled to comply with somebody's subjective ideas, whether or not it passes objective test. And this is really dangerous territory, really dangerous.
It seems to be an extension of political correctness. It seems that obviously political correctness, the idea being that we mustn't offend various minority groups, we mustn't hurt people's feelings, we're kowtowing to the emotional, and the political correctness, it seems to be have extended all the way into this gender thing, and now, as you're mentioning, legislation to back it up on hate crimes. That seems a very, very scary place to go, doesn't it?
It is, and in a way it's too late, because what's happened is that we have young professionals who were trained in academic establishments because a lot of this stuff will be news to the listeners, or it's fairly new subject to pick apart to this level of depth, but not to the people who have been through certain academic institutions in the last 20 or 30 years. So they've graduated, they've been fed all this information, and these people have then gone on to get jobs as policymakers and influencers. And these are the ones that are paving the way that's allowing this subjective, this objectification of the subjective to take over the central spaces where in the past it never would have been able to. Where it's going to go, we'll just have to wait and see. But certainly one can look to Canada as the litmus test to see what's happening. And it's getting quite chaotic over there from a gender point of view. At the minute, you can go in and you can just tell you, I could go in right now dressed like this, with my beard and everything, tell my GP in Canada that I identify as a female, that my friends call me she, and that I want to be called Belinda from now on, and would you so kindly sign the papers so that I can go and get my driver's license changed. And there's no need for me to be even attempting to dress or appear as a female in any way. Just merely my claim that that's what I am is enough to have my official paperwork changed, so that I can then use the legislation to make demands upon others to refer to me or treat me in particular ways.
Okay, so if we think of terms of the gender crisis, I would certainly identify the point that we've just been discussing as being one aspect of it. There is a crisis of confusion of identity, of people trying to create more genders through their own subjective experience. The other obvious issues, and I suspect, as in all subjects, they interrelate. The feminism, the equality of the gender, the male female equality. That is another big one that we probably need to unpick.
We have to address it. Yeah.
So, and it's obviously an ongoing one. Do you want to start us off with that one?
Yeah, I mean, really, so what we're in now is we're in what's called third or fourth wave feminism. And because the third and fourth wave feminists don't necessarily like or agree with the second and first wave ones. In a way, at the minute, feminism is really turning on itself with intersectionality, and it's an interesting battle to watch, an interesting war. The men are getting a slight bit of relief from the jibes of feminism by how they're turning on each other now. But one of the things that has happened in feminism is revisionism, which is to change the history. So, for example, you mentioned the suffragettes earlier on. So many people talk about the suffragettes and celebrate them. They were a terrorist group. They were terrorists. They literally sought to disrupt their communities to achieve their goals. They were not for equal rights. They were misandrists. They did not like men. There were the white feather ladies were very famous, and these white feather girls would go around to men who had avoided conscription or didn't go to the war, and they would shame them by presenting them with a white feather of cowardice. And that was to try to shame them to go to war and die, because this is the thing that most people don't understand about the vote, and it infuriates me. The reason some men had the vote, and it wasn't all men, almost half the men did not get the vote until the women did as well. But you don't hear anybody talking about that. I think it was about 34 or 44% of men, working class, non-property owning men, did not get the vote until the exact same time as women, and you hear nothing about that. All you hear about, woe is us, from the women's point of view. But here's the thing, those that did have the vote had the vote for a reason, and with the vote came the duty to serve in the military and go and die for your country. And that was why they had the vote. The vote was introduced for that kind of decision-making, saying, are we going to go to war and potentially die? Who wants to do that and who doesn't? So the ones who were going to be going and dying had the vote, all right? And in the period in between. And the white feather girls, who were suffragettes, exploited that by going and saying to these men, you've got the vote, you should be away being willing to die, by giving out these white feathers. But when the women got the vote, they didn't have the associated burden of having to go to war. So they didn't get the responsibility that went with the weight of the vote.
That's really interesting.
That is fascinating tragedy that the revisionists will avoid at all costs. Okay. The other thing the revisionists will avoid at all costs is that in 1804, I think it was 1804, I can't remember, 1804, so not that long ago, considering it was 19 whatever that the vote came in.
1918.
So 100 years before that, 4% of men had the vote.
Yeah, well,
4%.
This is why we need to know these things, don't we? We need to know this context.
Exactly. If you want to paint a picture of some kind of oppressive patriarchy, it's that 4%.
Yeah.
Nobody else. That 4% were the ones. They were the ones who had the decision making. They were the ones who did all this. They were the ones who were landed and wealthy and all.
Okay, so that kind of leads.
The tail end of that's and it was only until 80 years later, almost half the men got the vote, and then the rest of the men got the vote at the same time as women did. But you don't hear any of that. And the real equal rights movement was not the suffragettes, it was the suffragists. And the suffragists were about equal rights. The suffragettes were about not liking men, attacking men, blaming men, accusing men. And that's why the feminism of today celebrates that, because that's what they're about. They've inherited the suffragette infusion of equal right, it's not even equal rights, it's of feminism, which is the hints in the name. It cannot be an equal rights movement if it only names one of the genders. It's a total logical fallacy. It's total madness. And it doesn't matter what the dictionary says. So many women and men I've met said, well, if you look in the dictionary, the definition of feminism is equal rights. It's like, no, the hint is in the title. So if you want, there was a real equal rights movement, and that was the suffragists. And there are still some people who advocate for real equal rights today, but they are not feminists.
Okay, so that's an interesting little bit of backdrop there about this, the right to vote. So we've got this coming into, this relates into the oppressive Western male myth, doesn't it? Yes. Really. So we've come from the fact that there were a small number of men perhaps in charge of things. Now everybody has the vote, but we still have this. I mean, equal rights. I mean, obviously, most rational people would agree that equal rights is something desirable. Both men and women we're all humans, and basic human rights is important. But obviously, that would have to go on to define what rights are, and that's outside the remit of this conversation. But so we've got this sort of morphing then into feminism, sort of a man bashing, and is this totally due to this myth of the Western oppressive white male? How does that sort of relate into, and also tie in with the idea, is there something wrong with men? Why are men being so consistently attacked? The white heterosexual male.
Because we have a total misunderstanding of what masculinity and femininity is what the problem is here, which is going to bring us back to that subject in a moment. And the problem we've got is that women are viewing men through the eyes of the female, and the presumption that there's no difference between the sexes, because that's what they're told in school. And so men are being viewed as dysfunctional women. And that's what the issue is here. So the issue is that when men's behaviours are being judged, it's through the lens of, well, what would a woman do in that situation? And, oh my goodness me, a woman would never do that. This is horrific. This is toxic. This is dangerous. This is deadly. And the only reason we're in this position right now is because of how well the men have done their jobs up until now. So at the minute, what we have is the story of the oppressive white male, the oppressive Western male, who has done nothing but take, who has bullied everything it's come across, who continues to oppress when given the opportunity, things like that. Now that is a distorted picture. that uses examples where power may have been abused. But none of us can know the exact context of what was going on in any situation because we weren't there.
Dropping
for one
context.
thing. Yeah, exactly. The joy of context. But the interesting thing we're dealing with here is that the traditional roles of the men were done so well that they're kind of not needed at the minute, where the state has been given a lot of those roles. So, I mean, my background in gender, I've been working with gender for over 20 years. I've been teaching on the subject for 10 years. My history is in the Toltec gender model from Africa, which is it's steeped in wisdom and experience. And one of the things of the traditional role of the male would have been the keeper of the boundary. So the male would have been the one at the boundary of the territory. He wouldn't always be at home. So at the minute, we've got men and women who think they have to cohabit every day and things like that because of just how our culture is. But that's not how it would have been. Men would have been patrolling the perimeter. They would have been going on parties, hunting and resourcing parties beyond the perimeter. They may have been traveling for extended periods of time. But the point being is that they would be keeping safe the homestead or the community, which is where all that was valued would be kept, which would be the children, the women, the property, resources and assets. And obviously not wanting animals, predators or other humans to take those things or to abuse them in any way. That would be protected by this masculine energy that would both go and bring back new resource and also protect the boundary. Now, over the years, because we have essentially the evidence of that being done is on the table, because all you have to do is look at a map and you'll see the boundaries of all the nations and you'll be like, right, okay, this is where those debates ended. You know what I mean? As in the differences of ways of life, differences of language, differences of lifestyles, all that sort of stuff have become the nations we have today. And so that traditional role is kind of gone. It's all been codified into military and police now. It's been codified into law. It's been codified into international processes. And so traditionally, the spirit of man in terms of in my tradition is from the perimeter, from the edge where the unknown lies beyond, where I don't know whether I'm going to get bitten, eaten or fall down a hole. I just don't know what's out there. What can I do so that those that come after me can be safer, warmer, last longer, do better, dig further? And this kind of relentless spirit of man is what has given us our expanded territories and our incredible resources. So an example of that would be tools. So I want to give context for a minute here, and I am going to come round to why this is about the masculine and why this is why there's a distorted picture of feminism here. So things have not changed in 5,000, 10,000, 100,000 years. It takes as long now as it did 100,000 years ago to start a fire from scratch. It takes as long now as it did 100,000 years ago to build a shelter from scratch, unless you have tools. And the tools, more often than not, have come from men working at the edge, working in inhospitable, unfriendly environments, working on cold rock, wet weather, snow, rain, the whole shooting match, trying to be efficient, trying to be effective, trying to bring and lay everything that he finds at the feet of his women. The picture from the male point of view is, here is the safest place I have, the best shelter I have, and everything I've got, all my greatest resource I give to you, I lay at your feet, I will keep the bad things away. The way this is painted from the modern feminist revisionist perspective is oppression, women being kept at home, rather than it being a symbiosis of the needs of the family and the needs of the community being met by two different skill sets. And it was about who was the most skilled for the role. Now, don't get me wrong, some women would have gone to the edge and some men would have stayed at home, but a small percentage. We're looking at, it's probably similar to the intersex ratio, probably 1 or 2%. You'd always have 1 or 2 women who were butch and wanted to join the men, and 1 or 2 men who were effeminate and wanted to stay back with the women. These were the exception rather than the rule. Modern gender politics makes them the rule rather than the exception.
Gotcha.
So let's go back to our story, though. Back to the story. So the story we have is that now you and I can go out and we can buy a saw or a drill for just a few pounds. And we think, hey, this saw is good, I can go saw. And it's so taken for granted that this is a completed unit. But the saw was not an object made in one instance. the angles, the teeth, the number of teeth, the angles of the teeth, the shape of the handle have been refined over thousands of years, and thousands of men working at the edge to try to be more effective, be more efficient, get a better cut in there. And what the men did was they codified their experience into these tools, so that now, unless you're physically disabled, you can use the saw and get an accurate cut on a bit of wood that you would never be able to do without those tools. And in a way, having a saw is like having 1,000 ancestors in your hand. So the Native Americans, it really is though, the Native Americans would say our ancestors are the rocks and the trees. In the West, for us, our ancestors are in our tools and our processes and our systems. And we are, every time we wake up and we're not in a cold field with the rain on our head, it's because we're wrapped in the experience of our ancestors and their gifts. And when we're talking about shelter, safety and tools, it's the men that we can be thankful for. It's the men that have made most of those things, so that now, unless you're physically disabled, you can go and be safe traveling at high speed from one city to another in the West. You can go and buy some tools that'll make you make out like you can be a builder or a carpenter with no training. You can go and do some DIY for 50 quid and build a shelf or something like that, and it's like, wow, amazing. This is like codified masculinity. It's the codified experience of the men, and it was done so well that we don't even notice it now.
So this understanding of the male role, the male gender role, you're saying has been lost.
It's been lost in the blurriness of the last century, where in truth the men have not been fulfilling their role because they have forgotten where the edge is. Because the men are meant to be at the edge. And when we've got the men and the women both milling around in the middle of the community in the safe zone, there's going to be tension, there's going to be upset. And when the roles are no longer clear, like happened in our lifetimes in the last generation or two, women could get any job, men could get any job, you can wear whatever you like. When those traditional roles were broken down, men and women have become confused because they're like, oh yeah, what is my role, sort of thing. And it's become unclear because they've forgotten the qualities of the male and the female that gave rise to the roles. And that's the issue. This is where the blurriness is. They've forgotten that there were qualities that gave rise to the roles in the first place, rather than some dictatorship, which is what the revisionist feminists want to paint. Okay. So feminism is accusing men of doing what they have actually done. So women have sat down as a group and collected their grievances as if they were intentional deeds by men, rather than indirect consequences of the human muddle of none of us really knowing what we're doing. You know, it's a real pickle. But what we've got with the feminist movement is they are claiming woman power, but they are wrapped in an exoskeleton of masculinity when they're doing it. It's not female power, it's not women power at all. What we've got is women gender appropriating masculinity to wage their war on the men. It's like a robot. Have you ever seen one of these films where you wear a robo suit and it makes you super tough? This is what feminists have done, is they've donned a robo suit of the gifts of the men, which is the computer, the internal combustion engine, the legal processes, the tools, the buildings, the tap. All of these things are gifts of the men. And they're denigrating them. They're basically urinating over the graves of their ancestors while claiming oppression and bullying, while using all those gifts with abandon. So many feminists I've met have been like, men, what are they good for? Good for nothing. A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bike. And it's like, okay, never use your tap again. Never use your cooker again. Never set foot inside a house again. Never use a car again. Never use the law again. Never call the police again. Never use the military again. And my list goes on extensively, because this is a huge issue. Men need to stand on the pride of this, because so many men are feeling shame as being a man, and shame for the so-called crimes of men in the past, because they've forgotten the gifts of the men. They've forgotten the gifts. So modern feminism is really the masculine energy of the women flailing out of control. And this is why they just can't stop. They can't stop their attack because they don't know how to stop. They've gone to the edge of their world and they just cannot stop. They don't know how to temper this energy they've got and all the things that have been given to them for free.
Yeah.
Well, not for free. Some of them had to work hard for it, to be fair. But not most of the youth of today, that's for sure.
It's interesting that story that you tell about our ancestors and the heritage of the male. I
Yes.
heard somebody cracking a joke that they've got both sex organs. They had a penis and a brain, and with some sort of alluding to massive denigration of everything you just
Of
said
course.
there.
Of course.
It's just insane, isn't it? So
Exactly. It's outrageous. It's outrageous. I mean, I consider the third wave feminists and stuff insolent wretches. They're louts. They are
so
louts yeah.
can you put
Go on.
some clarity on these waves of feminism?
Yeah.
Are they distinguished by time? Can you
Yeah,
walk
they're
us through the
distinguished by
decades?
time. And they're distinguished by both time and by their purpose. So in a way, most of the ones that you and I will know who are in their, say, 40s, 50s, these are second wave feminists.
Okay.
And so the first wave is like your suffragettes. Even before that, you've got the ones, I can't remember her name, the very, very famous one that really, really hated men back in the 1850s. She was the one behind some of the early books on feminism, which was basically telling women, it's calling marriage institutionalized rape, saying that women had to, if women had to really, really turn off sex and have nothing to do with sex. It was the only way to win against men. She was kind of first wave feminism. Second wave feminism, so that was really the fight for the vote. Second wave feminism was perhaps the most balanced of the waves because there was a quest for equal rights there. There was a quest for equality of access. Equality of access is what second wave feminism was really fighting for, in my understanding and my paraphrasing. Third wave feminism is fighting for equality of outcome, and also it's the one that views men as dysfunctional women and views all masculine traits as toxic or dangerous, basically.
Okay, thanks for that. So it's interesting that the idea of seeing women as dysfunctional men through the eyes of a man, and also a woman seeing a man as a dysfunctional woman. That this
Yeah.
really does point to a fundamental lack of understanding of there are
It
men
does.
and there are women, and they're different. I mean,
Yes.
a lot of us will remember the 1992 book by John Gray, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus.
Yes.
Not that that's the definitive text on the issue, but it did in any way highlight some of the fundamental differences, the way our thinking works, our obvious skill sets, the obvious predisposition of men in general to be strong enough to go out and do the work,
Yeah.
and men, and women to be child rearing. I mean, those are the obvious ones, and it extends out. So where does this go then with the idea of gender inequality? The third wave feminists, you say, that was the beginning of calling for equality of the sexes, which to me sounds insane to call for the equality of the sexes, because it's like trying to make apples and oranges equal.
Yes. No, trying to make them the same.
The same.
Trying to make apples and oranges the same.
Yes.
Not even equal, is to make them the same.
Yeah.
And it's a horrific homogenization. It's a homogenization that has no basis in either biology, history, or reality. It's literally ideology driven. It's an ideology.
So do you think could we, for clarity there, for anybody that's new to this subject, could we differentiate then, do you think, between equal rights? Obviously, we've already mentioned that. Equal rights, absolutely. We're all for equal rights. It's illogical to not support equal rights for men and women. But equality, gender equality or inequality, whichever way around you're framing the argument, that really is a pointless goal, isn't it? Is it?
Well, I think the word equality is the problem here. I think what we want to seek is gender balance. In any situation, we want gender balance, and I think that is a much fairer thing to call for.
Complementary sexes rather than opposite sexes. I think.
Not even that though, because let's remember that we said earlier that there were some women who traditionally really associated with being masculine.
Yeah.
And so to me, if we're looking for gender balance, it's like even if you've got 5 really masculine women in the room, then for gender balance, you need some feminine energy. So you either need some feminine women or feminine men to bring about gender balance, because there are a lot of feminized men. We've got a lot of masculine women these days and a lot of feminine men, and that does blur it up a little bit, but it does mean that gender balance can still be achieved in any context, in any situation, by understanding. And this is where we need some gender understanding. We may have to delve a little bit into the essence of gender from my heritage anyway, to get a bit of clarity here.
Why don't we do that, Chris?
Yeah, let's do it. This is going to answer that question and give us some ammunition for the future. So in my background of Toltec gender, my work with it over 20 years has shown that we have so one of the problems we have in modern day is denoting, as you said, what is masculine and what is feminine, because if it's not the job and it's not your clothes, then what is it? And that's where we're at right now, because up until a certain point in time, and even now, it is being deemed that garments and jobs can be gendered, or they could be gendered in the past. So if I go out wearing a dress, people are going to think, in the West, if I wear a dress, it's going to be assumed that I'm, identifying with being a female in some way. Although you do get transvestites who would be male-identifying men who still like wearing dresses. To me, these are not gender issues. You can look at any indigenous tribe in the world and you'll find men and women wearing frocks, men and women wearing shorts. The clothes aren't gendered. We've made it a gender issue. Same with jobs. Jobs aren't gendered. We've made them gender issues. And the problem we've got is gender confused and gender upset people have been the ones dominating the narrative for the last generation. So you've got not many heterosexual people have been writing about gender over the last generation. We've got a lot of homosexual, trans and gender confused people doing a lot of writing as they're processing their gender confusion and their own orientation, which is fair enough, but it's skewing the story. So in my tradition, gender is an expression of electromagnetism. And what we have, so electromagnetism is everywhere in the universe. It's absolutely everywhere. It dominates so many of our technological advances, is the exploitation of the electromagnetic relationships in the universe. It doesn't stop at the outside of the human shell. We also are electromagnetic, and we also are prone to influence by electromagnetic forces. And in my tradition, the electrical component is the masculine in all of us, whether we're men or women. Doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman. The electrical component within you, which is whenever you feel charged up about something, that's your masculine. Whenever you're taking charge of something, that's your masculine. And the magnetic, the attractive, the drawing principle is the feminine. That's magnetic. And we all have both of them, which is, I think, what's given rise to some of the confusions of today. But the point I want to make right now is people don't even need to see it as absolute. If we just look at it as a language for gender that is already perfect, the language for gender is already electromagnetic. We already talk about being attracted to somebody. We already talk about the charged atmosphere somewhere, like a football stadium or somewhere like that, where traditionally men would go to vent their charge. It's all about the charge, and our culture is set up for the discharge of masculine energy, where pornography and games and alcohol are to discharge people's charged energy, which is their desire for change, So that's a very, very masculine force. Whereas whenever we're talking about the receptive, accepting forces, those are very feminine. And any behaviors that derive from those qualities are what make it masculine or feminine. But it's all men and women have access to both, is the point in my system. And I think this is what's given rise to the confusion of recent years, is not having that foundation. So the book I'm working on just now is to help us see that we already have a perfect, and I mean perfect, language for gender already in our language. In all of my courses, everybody gets it within an hour, and then they're all laughing later on, where they can easily spot when their friend, be they man or woman, is in their masculine or in their feminine. And then to enable effective interaction to take place, they can align with that by either flipping into the appropriate gender so that we have gender balance, which is fertile, or whether they stay in gender ignorance, which is infertile, which is where you have two people charged up with their points, Men make points, So two people charged up with their point making, there's no fertility there. Nobody's receiving from the other. There's no change going to take place. And that's just one example of where, or if both people are in there receptive, like what you'll find in meditation rooms all over the country, everybody drops into accepting the perfection of the now and all that sort of stuff, which is very feminine, very receiving, very accepting. But there's nothing, there's no dynamic principle there. Nothing is ever going to change from that. There's a therapeutic benefit, obviously, but there's no dynamic principle. So some people have tried to, especially in the non-heteronormative community, they've tried to rename these qualities of masculine and feminine as agency and communion. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's really in a lot of academic writing. All the stuff I've just talked about as being masculine, they would call agency or agentic. And all the stuff I said about the feminine, they would say, oh, that's communion, or as the feminine. But what I'm saying is, let's not invent new terms. That is just going to confuse everybody. We've already got perfect language. We already use it perfectly. And all we need to realize is that this is gendered language. And if we use it that way, we can all of a sudden know what's going on in any given situation. And to be effective, we can then, make what changes are required so that gender balance is achieved in that situation.
I like that.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. I like that distinction between the two roles of the genders, and when we learn an awareness of that, it almost helps us with all our interpersonal skills. And that's a key part of becoming more conscious, isn't it? Human beings, conscious of how we are relating to facilitate understanding, communication. So this is a really key issue.
It's a communication subject. I mean, what most people don't realize is that the communication is a gender subject, and that's why we talk about concepts. It's a conception. So when we talk about concepts and conception mentally and ideologically speaking, that's a gender language. And it's not accidentally there, is my point. My point is we already have perfect gender language. We just don't realize it's gender language. So you're right. We cannot communicate. There can be no conception, no new conception, if we don't have the gender balance that is fertile, which is somebody making a point and somebody receiving it. I mean, that's literally it. And that's what you see in the biological sex. The man makes a point and the female receives it. And that's what happens in communication. Whoever is making the point is in the male role. They're charged up with a point. They've got a point to make, and they want the other person to conceive with that point. It's literally gender. And if we don't get it right at this biological social level, there's no way it can work on a communication level. Because you're right, this is a life skill. It actually applies in every single interaction we have, which is why I'm so passionate about it, because gender wisdom and gender insight will make you more effective in every single interaction you have, because all of a sudden you'll know whether it's appropriate to make a point or whether it's appropriate to flip and receive from somebody else. And the difference by being able to do that and developing agility in it it massively improves relationships. It massively improves effectiveness. It massively improves every aspect of our interaction and how respected we are, how respected others feel around, because we are giving, we're receiving them when appropriate and we're making points when appropriate, Yep. And again, all this language is gender language, but when I use the language, you immediately know what I mean, don't you? You know what I mean when I talk about making a point. You know what I mean when I talk about receiving it. And this is what I mean about the language of gender. It's already perfect. We just need to realize that this is gender language. When we overlap the two, it's like, wow, we've got a really effective language here for denoting when somebody is in a particular gender permutation. Mm-hmm. How wonderful. Let's just do that instead of recreating castles in the sky based on somebody who's on the fringe who has a confirmation bias.
More floating concepts, unconnected reality is what we don't need.
Exactly, because this language is, I found that my gay people benefit from this because they recognize that they have masculine and feminine in their interactions. They love this. I've got gay clients who love this work, The ones that are the most challenged, though, are some of the youth of today because they're so disassociated from biology. But otherwise, most people who come across this work absolutely love it because the mind immediately gets it within minutes, and then they're off and running with gender alignment and gender insight in every situation they walk into. It's richly rewarding.
Fantastic. So, this obviously speaks to the potential cause of so many relationship problems. Relationships are in crisis everywhere, as we know. There are a lot of factors. So I wouldn't be so bold as to say it's just one, or maybe you've theorized that maybe it is that as the main issue. This blurring or lack of understanding of the gender roles, correct my wordage if I haven't got it exactly right, is that responsible for a lot of the breakdown of marriages? People talk about people not being able to stay together and all this sort of thing.
Yeah, we've got a big problem here. It is partly that. That's a big issue, because what we have these highly masculine women who are making lots of points and really charged up based on the data they've been given. And then we've got all these men who have been really feminized in the last 100 years, but with the lack of male role models, because something that happened in the last 100 years was that 20 million men died in the world wars, and these were men who would have been influencing their sons, and they are gone. And while they were away, the boys were at home with their mothers, being feminized just indirectly. It's just a side effect. So what we've ended up with is imbalance in the gender balance within relationships. But the biggest issue that's caused a breakdown in relationships over the last 2 generations is expectation. It's the expectation that people have been fed, the narrative that's been fed to them as to what they should be expecting from their partner. And feminism has got a lot to answer for here. In fact, not just feminism, Disney has got a lot to answer for, because they've created this idea of Cinderella and Prince Charming, of this one person who will be the font of all things for you, and that you should live with them in a small box every day for 30, 40, 50 years, when traditionally in the past humans have never lived that intensely. We've never lived so intensely where literally cohabiting so closely is such a burden. There's no time to for people to enjoy, as they say, absence makes the heart grow fonder. There's no time for people to experience and enjoy that. There's no time for people to have time to process and digest their experiences in those few days break they would have got while she was off at market or he was off hunting. We're not getting those windows to, and what happens is the unprocessed charge, which is a desire for change in them, builds and builds and builds until it's like, I can't be with you anymore, it's too much, But again, this expectation of, what men and women should be doing for each other or to each other or whatever, it's a massive issue. I would say the expectation has done more damage than anything else, combined with this not knowing when you're in masculine and feminine. It's a massive issue. The combination of those two, I think, is where the root of the problem is, and the state and academia have not helped this at all. Okay. They've really not helped this. Yes.
So is there another issue underlying that, or entangled within it, of is there any sort of agenda, do you think? Are gender issues simply a means of dividing us against each other? Because in the same way that racism has been deliberately used to set people against people, to get them preoccupied with irrelevance, basically, and fight amongst each other. I mean, is gender doing that? And if so, is it orchestrated? Is it deliberate, or is it just what's happening?
Very good question. One thing I'll tell you is for sure, and one thing is for sure, that the biggest threat to any empire builders in the past, the greatest threat to empire, and it's been tested by all empires, the biggest threat to empires are tribes and families. Because you can't break them apart. You can't coerce them. You can't send in spies. You can't buy them out. They're dangerous to state and empire. And in a way, we've already had our communities decimated, and this is the family unit being decimated. And it's to get into even turning children against their parents. The schooling system turns children against their parents, so they no longer see their parents as authority, which is very Orwellian. And what we're now seeing through the gender agenda is the breakdown between men and women, so that the future is segregation. It's already happening in workplaces. It's already happening off the back of Me Too, is that some men are calling for segregation because they don't feel safe around women. They don't feel safe because any time between now and in 20 years, that woman can say he did something with no evidence, and the witch trial will commence. And there's been men in high-profile places that have lost their jobs and lost their careers over accusations that have not gone through due process. There's been no legal case, and they're out of their jobs, and that's within the last last year, and the way it's going is segregation, and that is of massive, massive benefit to those who would seek to engineer a state, because it means that, because the side effect of this as well is that if men don't want to be with women and women don't want to be with men, it means that they don't want to have children. And if they don't want to have children, then it means that, first of all, those who wish to control fertility and control the population are laughing and rubbing their hands with glee, because we're already at the stage now where across the board a large number of millennials and the generation after them are saying that, oh, children, no, I want to party, I want to rub myself wherever I like, I want to travel. These are the big hitters these days. If you look at the big trending topics on the new media platforms, the kind of the fantasy or the illusion of the traveling entrepreneur is like the new cherry on the cake of life. And all these youngsters are pursuing being the traveling entrepreneur that can charge high ticket prices while they sit on their laptop in Bali or something like that. And so many are pursuing that dream, and the ones that aren't pursuing that dream want to be on X Factor and want to be a singer or something like that. But again, the service to life of having children just doesn't factor in there. And the great thing for the social engineers is that, oh, nobody wants to have children, don't worry, give them to us, we'll bring them up. And so at the minute, the state have managed to intervene from age 5 onwards, and they've kind of got voluntary intervention from age 2 onwards with nursery. The long-term result of this, if you ask me, from somebody who's been working on this for over 20 years, the long-term result of this is basically the quest to control fertility. And it's about taking control of fertility itself. And we're already seeing that, because if you've got so many people who have infertile gender preferences, or, behavioural preferences, so infertile behavioural preferences to do with sex, then when, they are then going to have to go to the state or the fertility clinic or something like that to say, hey, can we have one of your babies, please? And that's pretty much what's happening now with the number of non-fertile relationships that now have secured children, either through paying for, through the free market, or the near free market has given them access to children. So I see that as just continuing, really, and it's beyond tragic. It really is beyond tragic. And in a way, I invite the listeners not to be too worried about that, because in a way, these ideologies are infertile. They can only go so long. Theoretically, without the free market, all of these people and their ideologies would literally be the end of the branch of their lineage's tree of life. It's gone. And if you look at the super wealthy, the influencers, that 4% that we were talking about before, because their families are still in power, the same 4% that were in power in 1804 are still in power now, same families are there. None of them are restricting their breeding. None of them. All of them are still having plenty children to ensure their branch of the tree of life is strong and secure, while they're tricking all these young people into ideologically ending their entire ancestral line. It's so funny to me. I see people that are being shown images of busy cities. They're showing images of busy cities and starving people in Africa and mountains of food, and they're being told overpopulation, and they're like, oh, I'm not going to have children. There's too many. Like, have you not seen all the empty fields? Have you not seen all the empty spaces? And again, they're being misled down an ideological route, and the gender's another one, where, they've been given an ideology in these so-called higher education establishments, and they're being tricked into ending their entire ancestry, as if all ancestries were equal. I'll tell you what, there's not a single one of those dominant families in the world who thinks ancestry is equal. None of them think that. None of them. There's a real denigration of heritage here. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's fantastic. Some amazing insights coming at us here, Chris. This is marvellous. So, just to bring it back to feminism and the way the gender equality call, the battle cry of the women, obviously having some result in feminizing men to some degree, even if I look back at the last 20 years of my life, and sort of you kind of feel that general approval of the sort of feminine man, the sort of the feminine side. that sort of thing. So how does that relate to the fact that these days men don't really know how to be men? There aren't any role models around. I mean, I struggled in my generation. I'm 52, with growing up without role models, but it seems to me that that's much worse these days.
It is worse. It is much worse, much worse. You know, and I'm a decade behind you, and it was the same for me. But I think this has been useful. This has actually been a really good period for humanity because, despite what it looks like, because greater balance and greater insight and greater capacity will be the result. And that is the thing. But the situation the men are in at the minute is that a new masculinity is called for, but it's not a feminine masculine. That's the issue. The men have to rediscover masculinity. So what's happened is a lot of these femi men, that's what I call them, femi men or cosmo men, and I call it a cosmo man because I was a cosmo man. I read Cosmopolitan magazine with the other lads round the coffee table at school in the 80s, and we thought, oh, this is what women say they want. If we make ourselves like that, then they're going to want us. What a lot of nonsense. Total rubbish. What that does is that makes a woman feel very safe around a man and makes her feel like that she is in control of the situation. When a woman is around real masculine energy, she doesn't feel in control, and she doesn't like that. It doesn't mean the man is going to exploit that position. That's the thing. And the thing is, you'll find it, you generally only find it in moments of intimacy, but this is why you've got that thing of why women love bad boys. You know,
right.
and it's the case, and why women leave their femi men in middle age to go for an ex-army guy or something like that, which is really, really common. And it happens because there's a part of them that wants to be ravished, that wants to be swept off her feet around that powerful, safe masculine energy, that wild man. And the problem we've got is that the wild men have been tamed, and the women are like, yeah, it's all right, can we be friends, sort of thing, while secretly going for the bad boy, because part of them really wants that feeling of not being in control, but they want it on their terms. Sadly, feminism and feminists generally don't like that feeling. They don't like that energy. Often many feminists wouldn't have been targeted by many men anyway, and part of these things gives rise to some of the stuff that's coming out now, like, for example, the Formula One girls and the darts girls. You know, in a very real way, them losing their jobs is the backlash of the traditionally unattractive women, you know, suddenly getting her way, because obviously these traditional attractive women would benefit from their gender and benefit from their sex because men would accolade and celebrate them and roll over for them, obviously, but not for these other women. It's a really this is like female politics coming out here now as well to some extent. But the men definitely need new rites of passage. That's something I'm working on just now, is new rites of passage for men, because it's about us understanding that the edge has moved, and we need to understand that for us to find our masculinity, to find our brotherhood, because the women have found their sisterhood, the men have lost theirs. And, you know, for the men to this is what our community, our cultures and individuals need, is to rediscover these things so men can reclaim a pride in being a man and lose the shame and the guilt that's been given to them. You know, feminism is really doing a great job of punishing men for the deeds of other men. Now, there's no legal system in the West that would allow that. You know, there's no way you could take it to court and say, do you know that 300 years ago, some men did this, and because of that, you may not speak. And that's exactly what's happening. It's a total insanity. I mean, you want to talk about equality. There's zero equality there. But what we're dealing this is that point-making energy, that masculine point-making energy in these women running out of control. They're in a robo-suit. They don't know how to control. They cannot stop, perceive again, and notice that the world has changed massively in their favour and already enough in their favour. But they just can't stop. There's a machine running out of control. And the only thing that can stop it from running out of control is to men to rediscover their masculinity again. And what's happened is they've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. That's what a lot of the femi men have done is. So they've thrown the baby out with the bathwater, saying, oh, masculinity is so damaging, so disgusting. My dad was horrible to my mum and horrible to everybody else. And all these stories of the men, I want nothing to do with it. That's happened. That's already happened. But what's going to happen to all of these men is they're either going to get to a stage where they're so dissatisfied with their life that they're going to have to say, wait a minute, what do I need to get through this? Oh, wait a minute. I need that capacity. I need that energy. I need that quality. And in a way, we've got to reclaim and polish off the masculine so that it can, evolve into, more refined and skillful behaviours, because that's what the issue is here. It was never the masculine that was the problem. It was the distorted behaviours that came from it. And if we give space for it to blossom, then it can become beautiful and amazing and needed. But if we don't give it any space like we're doing now, then it's going to continue to spasm out of control. The policing of the men in the way that it's happening now is not the solution. It's just going to create more problems. It's an absolute disaster zone. Feminism's a disaster zone.
So how can young men today discover their masculinity? How can older men reclaim their masculinity? Obviously, education is going to be a part of it. What you're saying is amazingly enlightening to me, and I'm sure to others. Are there any places one can go? I mean, what do you see to try and turn to being slightly solution orientated now?
Yeah.
How's that going to happen?
Yes. So obviously there's my books and my workshops. Book's not out yet, but it is available. You can sign up on my mailing list and know when it's going to come out. It'll be out within the next couple of months, so I am almost finished it. Working title: Gender for Dummies. That's just a working title, and Smarty Pants. So that's one place. Also, my events. I'm looking to collaborate with other men's workers here in the UK to put on events for boys and men for this kind of thing that will be accessible, because I think, as you say, the education is key. Just even listening to this helps so many people remap what's going on inside them. It's that simple a process here. This is just a bit of mental remapping, a bit of conception, and all of a sudden it all makes sense and locks into play process to get the wiring right in the mind. Then we can talk about what can be life to reclaim your masculinity, because that's the second stage. One thing I want to say is that the generation of men that grew up without male role models like yourself and like me, we are now coming of age, and some men have not made it. They have given over to addiction. They have given over to being feminized. They are addicts and lost in the world, basically lost in hopelessness. A lot of them have gone down the route of MGTOW, men going their own way. They don't want anything to do with women, things like that. But there are another bunch of men who have dredged up the positive within the masculine, and they are now speaking out. And so there are many programs and courses around the world these days for men. But I am wary as to how beneficial many of them are, because a lot of them are really from this masculinity is dangerous and let's be more feminine, and it's really, really dangerous. And the other thing is, a lot of the men's work that's out there is about therapeutic processing. So really it's basically therapy for men. So there's a lot of crying, there's a lot of hugs, there's a lot of upset, but there's nothing about the masculine moving forward. There's a couple of things which are useful. There's a Mankind Project, which is very famous for its work around the world. I haven't done their process, but I've heard good things. And there's new men's movements kicking off in Scandinavia and in the UK. One called Men 2 with a number 2, as if it's like Men version 2. And there's obviously a couple of others. I invite people to do a search to find a program that resonates with them, because what I've found is that most of the men that are putting on these services have a niche that is about what their life was about. So if you had a bullying mother, then there's maybe one particular guy who's doing work that will be of benefit to you. Same for a bullying father, same if you're an addict, things like that. In terms of general gender that's useful for everyone, I only know of myself in the Toltec work. I don't know of anyone else that's doing it at this level. I mean, the books that got me started are a little bit dated now, but I'll be happy to share them with the audience.
Great. Well,
the quest.
Perhaps you can just recap then on how people can contact you, Chris?
Yeah, well, at the minute I have a few websites, but the best one to just get direct contact with me is alternativeanswers.net. alternativeanswers.net. If you go to alternativeanswers.net, there's a little summary about me there, and you can get a link to get in touch with me. I do one-to-ones over Skype. I also do intensives. I'll be teaching on the Wild Man retreat this year, in the middle of the year in Sussex, if anyone's interested. I'll also be doing another Right at the Edge with an RITE, so it's Right at the Edge, which is going to be initiation stuff for men going on in the Highlands of Scotland and also in England later in the year. So get in touch to join in with that, and also just to keep abreast of what I'll be getting involved in, because I'm just starting to get plugged into some other men's networks to share some of this work. I'll be speaking at the International Conference on Men's Issues in just a couple of months' time, which will hopefully connect me up with some other service providers. I'm hungry to put on things for men and women to do this. I'm hungry to make this information available. That's why I'm working on the book, so that everybody will have access to this language of gender that will give them the ability to map within them and their relationships when they're in which mode and how to flip and all that sort of stuff, so that we can all be more effective regardless of our orientation or preference, because this is universal, it applies to all of us. All of us have the electromagnetic gender in us, So yeah, alternativeanswers.net, get in touch.
Great stuff. Well, look, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, Chris. Really appreciate that. I, for one, feel incredibly educated in such a short time. I mean, you've how shall I say that? You've kind of thrown some light on so many issues. I feel that dots have joined in my head. Just so I do hope that some of you listeners have got the same experience. And thank you for joining us, Chris. And I do hope that you'll all maybe be inspired to look further into this gender issue, as indeed Chris says, it just affects all of us. And contact Chris at alternativeanswers.net to be abreast of when his book comes out.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I do hope you've all
having me on.
Thank you so much, and I do hope you've all got some value from this. Please feel free to comment and hit the like button on YouTube, etc., etc. And most of all, I do hope you'll join me again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be